Hi, good afternoon. We're delighted to be joined by Gordon Brown, who, as you know, is the Secretary General's Special Envoy on Global Education. Sir, welcome again.
Yeah, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I want to talk today about the 99% of the world's young refugees who are the lost generation that are now becoming the invisible generation, who will never get a place in college or higher education. Only 1% will. And the 80% of refugee teenagers who will never get a secondary education, only 20% will. A lost generation is not only identified by empty classrooms and silent playgrounds and short unmarked graves. A lost generation is one where hope dies in those who live. And the urgency of talking about this today comes not only as the Security Council is briefed on the difficult circumstances in Yemen affecting millions of children, but as this year starts with escalating crises, the estimated 3 million exodus from Venezuela, 500,000 out-of-school children alone in the Central African Republic, the need to reopen 1,000 schools in Afghanistan, where there are still 3.7 million out-of-school children, and the ongoing refugee crisis as a result of what is happening in Myanmar, in Sudan, in Syria, and in other parts of the world. The desolation of this lost generation was brought home to me over these last few months with reports from the Moria refugee camp in Greece, where no formal education is on offer to any of the hundreds of children who are there. And we found that 2 young boys, one only 10 years old, had attempted suicide. Now, that's an age of 10 when life should be in front of you, full of hope and excitement at every new dawn. But young people so devoid of hope at the age of 10 that they were attempting to take their own lives. Now, on Thursday, that is February 21st, that's the day after tomorrow, the Education Cannot Wait Fund, which I chair and which is headed by Yasmin Sharif, and which was set up to provide opportunity for displaced children in crises, will launch with its coalition a programme for safe and reliable education for 500,000 children in Afghanistan, including more than 320,000 girls. Then, on 27th February, in the Central African Republic, a coalition with ECW will launch a new 3-year education programme to get to 900,000 children, half of whom, again, are girls, to address the violence and displacement that has left nearly 500,000 children there out of school. That follows the programme we launched in Uganda in September to help with the influx of South Sudanese refugees, and we aim to catalyse 1.8 billion in education finance for displaced children and refugees by 2021. And current investments will reach 2.5 million children, but our aim is to go further in these next few years. We have 25 priority countries. We're already in 19 of these countries. And of course, we are dealing with 12 million child refugees, 30 million displaced children, 75 million children, more than the whole population of a country like Germany, caught in conflict and in emergencies. We find that children are broken not just by the waves that submerge the life vests on a boat that is trying to bring refugees to Europe, or the convoy that does not make it to the besieged town. We find that children are broken by the absence of hope, the soul-crushing certainty that there is nothing ahead for which to plan or prepare, not even a place in a school classroom. And what's holding them back now is not just their location, their homelessness and their poverty, but the death of their dreams. Something that has been reported from so many parts of the world where we now have refugees and displaced children. Now, the only way to reach the Sustainable Development Goal, the United Nations goal for every child at school, is for a child's real passport to the future stamped in the classroom and not at a border checkpost. We need education without borders, in other words, the right of even the stateless and the displaced child to a quality education. And we are, of course, launching in the next few weeks the International Finance Facility for Education, which is designed to serve 700 million children living in low and middle income countries where the majority of the out-of-school children of the world are, and where the greatest number of displaced children live. And this finance facility is advancing rapidly with support from the World Bank, the regional development banks, the United Nations itself, and we hope to have an event in April where prospective donors will be asked to contribute what could in the end be a 10 billion fund that could make it possible for us finally to deal with the needs of millions of displaced and refugee children around the world. You've heard about Yemen today. I'm talking about the other crisis-affected countries. It's time the world woke up to the horror of so many children devoid of hope. Thanks, and I'll prepare to answer any questions.
Great, thank you very much. Madam.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. You mentioned the crisis in Venezuela. Has your office has made approach to the government of Venezuela to try to assist with any education, help for the kids of Venezuela? We know that they have a humanitarian crisis. They have the exodus of children, but also inside Venezuela is problems to have access to food and to have medicines.
Yeah, well, I am not the person that would be contacted immediately, but we will be working with the UN agencies whenever they're called upon to give help. What we know is that we've got an impending crisis, indeed a crisis at the moment. Yeah.
Joe?
Thank you, sir. Joseph Klein, Canada Free Press. Again, thank you for the briefing. Is Nigeria one of the priority countries? You mentioned there were 19. And with respect to Nigeria and refugees coming from Nigeria, I believe, into Cameroon, is there any consideration of leveraging institutions that are already been formed, schools for girls, for example, who have either been released or escaped from Boko, the terrorists in Nigeria.
Boko Haram.
Boko Haram. Is there any consideration, for example, there was a report recently, I believe it was on 60 Minutes, talking about a very effective school that's trying to rehabilitate and integrate such girls and educate them. Are you going to be leveraging?
Well, I was involved, as some of you may know, with the attempt to bring back the girls who were kidnapped and abducted from Chibok in northern Nigeria. And some, of course, have never returned. Some who did return could not obviously go back to the schools or the kind of schools that they've been at, and were put in were educated in other parts of Nigeria. And of course, some suffered great psychological harm and had to have special care. In Nigeria, which of course you know is in limbo because the elections were postponed this week, we reckon there are now 13 million children who are not going to school. So Nigeria has the biggest out-of-school population in the world, bigger than Pakistan, bigger than other countries. It is still spending only around 2% of its national income on education. We are prepared through the International Finance Facility and other means to give support to Nigeria to improve its education system, but it will have to be a partnership between the government and the international agencies, and we are stand ready to help in that way. But you're absolutely right, special provision has got to be made for those people who were abducted, and those people who have suffered psychological trauma as a result of what has happened.
Just to follow, what about working with the schools that I referred to that are already established, and from all reports are having some success in instilling confidence?
I know what you're talking about. In fact, you know, in Nigeria, there's a large number of children who are at boarding schools as opposed to day schools, and there is some special provision for children who've suffered psychological trauma. Education cannot wait. It can help, obviously, when there's displacement, when children are displaced. But I think we've got to look at Nigeria as a whole. There are 13 million children in total who are not at school, and this is a massive educational problem that's got to be addressed by the government and the international agencies working together.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ibtisam Azim from Al Arab Al Jadid newspaper. I have a couple of questions. The first one regarding the U.S. and the borders and the refugees who are coming here. To which extent it are held on the camps? To which extent you are concerned about the education, especially for children. And the second question is regarding Syrian refugees in Lebanon. In the past, you talked about the program that you, the shift programs, the schools in the afternoon for Syrian children. Could you update us on that? And also regarding UNRWA and education for Palestinian children in Gaza. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we've got to say that over the last few years, of 2.1 million Syrian refugees who are outside of Syria, not just the displaced people within Syria, but outside Syria, about 1.4 million, about two-thirds, are now in education in one way or another. And that has been a major success, although I'd like to see all children in school. But from a time when there were hardly any of the refugees at school in Lebanon, it's now something like 400,000. And I think about 300,000 of them at the moment, perhaps just a bit less, are in the double shift schools. So they get their education in the afternoon after the Lebanese children get educated in French in the same classroom in the morning, French and English. They're educated in Arabic in the same classroom in the afternoon. And the double shift schools have proved to be cost effective because we're using the same facility. They cost about $600 per child. And it is one of the lessons we've learned from humanitarian provision here, that it is possible when you've got refugees dispersed across a country and not in camps, it is possible to use the existing education system to provide schooling for children. Some of it's done in Jordan, some in Turkey as well. But the major success of double shift schools has been in Lebanon, and I think this helps us look at how we can plan for the future. I also was involved, as many of you may know, in UNRWA's attempt to get additional funding, and I think a number of countries have come in at what was a desperate situation for the Palestinian refugees. As far as the American border is concerned, I think your question is really not for me, it's for President Trump. But the principle must be that no child should be denied education, and we would want to make sure that every child has the chance of an education.
Mr. Bays.
James Bays, Al Jazeera. One of your target countries is Afghanistan. I'd like to get your thoughts on Afghanistan. Early on, after the intervention in 2001, education was seen as a success story. Mm-hmm. How would you describe it now? Is it still a success story? And as someone who deals with this now, but has also dealt with Afghanistan in a very different capacity in the past, what are your thoughts about the talks taking place with the Taliban, given the Taliban's view in the past on education?
Well, I think some of your questions are probably for the British Prime Minister and not for the UN Special Envoy. I will deal with the questions that are relevant to the Special Envoy. When we decided to invest in education in Afghanistan, we increased the number of children in school, if I remember right, from 2 million to 6 million. So there was a massive shift in the opportunities for girls particularly, who had never really had the chance of education under the Taliban, to get the chance of going to school. And there was a major investment made by all the coalition partners in education. At the moment, as you see from the figures that I'm giving you, there are 1,000 schools in Afghanistan that need to be reopened, partly because of the violence that has taken place in the last year or two. And there's 3.7 million out-of-school children. That is still, in the schools in Afghanistan, a far larger number than there were before the Taliban were removed. But clearly, that is not satisfactory. We have got to do more. And one of our obligations to the people of Afghanistan, particularly to the children of Afghanistan, must be to ensure that these 3.7 million children, 2 million of them are girls, so a far bigger proportion are girls than there are of boys, are no longer denied the education that is their right. You're tempting me to venture into other questions, and I'm not really going to do so. I'm just going to emphasize that in every country in the world, we should be aware that there are now 260 million children who should be at school today, who are not going to school today. That's 250 million children. And as far as the current trends take us, unless we take the sort of action that I'm suggesting, like creating this new education facility, even in 2030, there will still be more than 200 million children who are not going to school. And that is a figure that must be completely unacceptable in a world where every single country, every part of the international community signed up to the Sustainable Development Goal that said that every single child would not only be in school, but be in primary and secondary education and getting a quality education by 2030. We are so completely off track that we need these emergency measures now to be taken in 2019 if we're going to have a chance of meeting the Sustainable Development Goal target by 2030. And Afghanistan is one of the countries, Pakistan, Nigeria, Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. These are some of the countries where we've got the biggest out-of-school populations of children, and it is completely unacceptable, and it is avoidable.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
Again, on Afghanistan, we were told several months ago that there were 4 million illiterate children in Afghanistan among the poor. I finally got an understanding of what illiterate meant. It meant they cannot read or write, which is to be imprisoned in a way. Now, under the government of President Najibullah, it was required by law that every child, girl and boy, go to school. This was a legal requirement, and that government was overthrown. There seems to be a tendency to overthrow governments that prioritize education and health care. And what can be done about that?
I don't think you can draw a general lesson about every government who has universal healthcare and universal education being overthrown. I do think, however, that your figure is right, that there are nearly 4 million children who, because they are not going to school, are inevitably going to lack any reading, writing, and arithmetic skills. And therefore, you would classify them as illiterate, and that is completely unacceptable in the modern age. So the figure of 4 million is one. I think the actual figure reported at the moment is 3.7 million, but 2 million of these are girls, and therefore a very high proportion of the out of school are girls, and that is, again, completely unacceptable. We pledged when Afghanistan happened and the Taliban was overthrown that every single child should get a chance of an education. We have got to do more. But this program is being launched in Afghanistan by Yasmin Sharif tomorrow. And because education cannot wait as a catalyst, so it moves in with partners to try and persuade others to do more as well. The commitment that they're making tomorrow to 900,000 children is a very substantial commitment, both in terms of money and in terms of numbers, but we are waiting for other agencies to come in and to make up the rest of the money that is necessary to get every child into school. So Education Cannot Wait is announcing, not tomorrow, Thursday, in Afghanistan, that it is providing this funds, 500,000 in Afghanistan, 900,000 in the Central African Republic.
Mr. Brown, Arthur Macmillan from the National newspaper. Thank you again for the briefing. You signal some optimism from the case of Lebanon on how things have perhaps improved a little, but you mentioned the rather dire situation in Moria, and a 10-year-old, contemplating suicide because of the dire situation they were in. I just wondered, as someone who has obviously been responsible for implementing in your past position foreign policy, but now that you're in a more specialised role with the UN, what you thought of the political tone in Europe in particular, and I'm thinking about Greece and the recent years in which we've seen, frankly, the demonisation of migrants in Europe. And, for example, at the UN, as you'll be very well aware, there were significant countries who wanted nothing to do with the Global Pact on Migration, which has in many ways overshadowed the plight facing children who are not getting an education. And I just really wondered what you thought in terms of the political will to actually do something about this in mainland Europe at the moment.
The problem with Moria as a camp, and I know something about it, someone who worked for me visited it and gave me a report about what was happening, is that the money was allocated. The European Union did come up with the money, so there was some political will to do something about this. But this camp, which I think was originally for 3,000 people, it's got about 8,000 people there. It's completely overcrowded. The sanitary conditions are terrible. If it's going to be kept open, then it's got to be improved. If people are going to be moved elsewhere, then they've got to provide the places for that to happen. But it's not a shortage of allocated money. It's that the money did not, in the end, get through. And if you look at the notes to the press notice that you've got there, MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, were reporting multiple cases. I mentioned a child of 10, but they said that nearly a quarter of the children that they'd interviewed had self-harmed, attempted suicide, or had thought about committing suicide, and the level of violence in that camp was completely unacceptable. So your premise may or may not be right about what Europe was saying and doing and the public mood in Europe. But the truth is that money was allocated and it should have got to the Moria camp. And either it should have been replaced by another camp which would have been better conditions, or the money should have been invested in Moria. And these children have suffered as a result, and they face daily threats of violence, as well as the other problems of being without proper food, without proper sanitation and nutrition, and without any formal education in this camp at all. There is informal education, but that, I gather, has also run out of money. But there's no formal education for any child, and you can see what the consequences of that are. So the political will to provide the money was there, but the money never got through.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We'll be back in 2 seconds with a brief.